A playoff berth, a stable coaching staff, and good goaltending has St. Louis Blues fans excited for what the next year could look like. But will their success be sustainable? And are the Blues primed to be looking to move back into cup contention very soon? This is a 2025-26 deep dive on the St. Louis Blues. Hello and welcome to team number 14 on my deep dive series. And we're moving now into really the tier of teams that should be pushing for playoff spots and are potentially hoping that their seasons are going to be more than just, a one-round playoff appearance. And for the St. Louis Blues, they were really 1 second away from making that a reality, right? And being a second-round team, and they really had a very strong second half of the season last year. And it led to a situation where they were literally a second away from taking down the Jets and beating the President's Trophy winners in the first round. And all of that is great, but the goal now is just to see if that's going to be sustainable, right? If they can be a consistent year-to-year team, a team that's going to be competitive year-to-year, and a team that's going to be able to really sustain the success they had at the end of last season. And the Blues season last year kind of felt like it did in 2019. Obviously not with the insane low that they had at the beginning of 2019, and it didn't end with the same high. But a year where the first half of the season, the Blues really didn't feel like they were legitimate, playoff contenders. And then as the year kind of went on, they got hot, and obviously, post Four Nations, Jordan Binnington was really solid, and the team itself kind of just came together. I think that really gives the Blues a lot of hope for what this year should look like. They didn't suffer any major losses to the team. They didn't go out and make a bunch of significant adds either. But getting a full year of Cam Fowler, they bring in Pius Suter. They're hoping for some success out of some of their young players, right? Like Logan Mayou's going to get a decent look at the roster this season. And obviously they move off from Zachary Bolduc, but overall, the Blues team is relatively stable compared to what it was last year. And I think that the expectation should be set along the same lines of what they had, going at the end of the last season, right? I think making the playoffs should be an expectation, and being in contention to, at least get out of the first round should definitely be part of their overall goals going into this season. We look at where they rank kind of overall here, and 15th in offense, 20th in defense, 8th in goaltending, 27th in special teams, and 10th in coaching culture. This team is really, you really saw what Jim Montgomery was able to do for the Blues and helping sustain them as a team moving forward. And, the offense is good. I think that the top half of the roster is serviceable, in terms of being a playoff team. I think, the Kyrou Thomas, Buchnevich kind of top end of the roster is good enough. And I think the depth is pretty solid as well. But there's nobody on this team that I really look at as a true, over the top game breaker. Robert Thomas definitely had signs of that throughout his run, especially in the playoffs last year. He was phenomenal in the series against the Jets, and really towards the end of the season was a really solid contributor overall. The blue line is fine. A lot of it really rides on what a second year of Philip Broberg looks like in St. Louis, and really also relies on what a guy like Logan Mailloux can bring in, or even Tyler Tucker could be kind of a wild card. Colton Parayko being healthy and being able to be that stable defensive defenseman. All those things really kind of weigh in, but again, the blue line really doesn't have a game breaker on it yet, and they're hoping that Logan Mailloux can maybe become that. That might be a lofty expectation from at this point. The goaltending is good, right? Obviously Jordan Binnington is one of the more underrated goalies in the league, but Joel Horford is also a very solid backup, one of the best backup goalies in the NHL. So having that tandem really gives you the stability of knowing that you have a starter you can rely on, but also a backup goalie that you believe in and you like, and somebody that can eat games for you. The special teams is definitely the weakest part of this team. And the coaching culture is good. Like I believe in the management team. I believe in the coaching staff. And I think that's a good place to kind of start our discussion here with, Doug Armstrong, who I think has done a really good job navigating this team from what it looked like in 2019 to where it is now. I think that you've, obviously moving on from the Tarasenko core and the Pietrangelo core into kind of this next wave has been a pretty good transition. And, obviously bringing in somebody like Jim Montgomery, who I didn't have a ton of faith in going into his tenure here, but certainly has been proven wrong, at least, through the first bit, where he looked like an exceptional head coach and really helped turn around what the Blues season was. For me, it's just going to be about keeping this stability going, right? Like if Doug Armstrong can keep pressing the right buttons and keep, making moves like he did with Holloway and Broberg, which was a very, very, low risk, very fairly high reward. He brings in a guy like Pius Suter, who I think is in the same boat, and just continuing to do stuff like that. Same with Cam Fowler, right? Like another guy who was a low risk, pretty good reward, and that one worked out as well. So keeping that kind of momentum chain going is going to be very important for making sure that this team can sustain success into this year and kind of moving forward here too. Because I think the Blues are in a position where if the buttons aren't pressed correctly from in the next 3 years, that they could stall out. And this could be kind of the ceiling for this group as being a first, second round team that might go on a run once to a third round, but it's very it's not guaranteed that's going to happen. But you got to keep improving this roster, and it seems like Doug Armstrong's done a decent job of that. I'd like to see him be slightly more aggressive in terms of adding players at this point, but again, there wasn't a ton out there this year to bring in, and St. Louis obviously isn't the highest most notable free agent destination is the word I'm looking for. So it is tough in that sense, but I think he's done a good enough job putting the pieces together on this team and making some really shroud moves. I don't love the Bolduc Logan Mailloux trade for St. Louis. I think Zach Bolduc was a really useful player, but again, they had a surplus of kind of your young up and coming wingers, and they really needed some offensive pop on the blue line. So I get it in terms of a team standpoint, but I don't think it was necessarily the best use of their assets in that sense. But in the end, they're a playoff hopeful. They're a team that I think is slightly ahead of Minnesota and Utah in terms of that fourth place spot in the division. I don't know how much of a gap that is. Obviously these teams are very close in my rankings, but they're one was 17th, and then you had 15 and 14. So the gap is very small between those teams, but they're all kind of in that log jam there. Honestly, you could sort them however way you want, and it wouldn't really upset me. But I just think that St. Louis, what they showed in the second half last year, is enough for me to believe that they could be that, hopefully, for most of the season. We look at their numbers here, and I think their numbers are a little bit misleading. Their expected goals numbers are terrible, and they really, really outscored those last season. They're number one in terms of finishing, especially comparatively to their expected numbers. But their defense was really solid. This was a team that was exceptional defensively, and really didn't allow a ton of goals either. So it really is, especially in terms of their defensive numbers, it's very much it's better than the sum of their parts team. On paper, especially the blue line, isn't phenomenal in terms of what they can bring defensively, and even the forward core isn't exceptional in terms of their individual stuff. But I think really the system is what really helped propel this team forward, and you really saw that as the year went on. And I think Jim Montgomery did a very good job setting up a good defensive system. We've seen him do that before, where he's able to kind of get the most out of his players defensively just based on schemes and how he's tactically laying out his team. And I think that's what we saw in St. Louis a lot of the time, and I expect that not to change. That's been kind of a big part of his system so far. In terms of their power play and penalty kill numbers, neither were very good. Their penalty kill was horrid last season. They're also weren't generating a ton of offense on the power play, especially compared to their finishing, and their finishing wasn't great. Defensively, they were allowing more goals than they probably should have, but between the two of them, neither unit was very, very impressive overall last season. We jump into this forward core, and kind of like what I talked about earlier, it's almost like it's good enough as a top core in terms of like what you need as like a playoff team, but there's nothing on it that really jumps out. Like they don't have like that bona fide superstar player, right? Like Robert Thomas is probably the closest thing they have to that, but the rest of it's fine. Like Pavel Buchnevich is a really, really good underrated winger. Jordan Kyrou is a fantastic two-way player. Even down the middle, right? Like Braden Shen is a fine second line center. I really like the pickup of Pius Suter. I think a lot of teams should have been going after him, and they just weren't. You have Dylan Holloway, Jake Neighbors, guys I think are really good for that role. And then you have some questions. I mean, Jimmy Snuggerud is going to be somebody to really keep an eye on this year. Even Dylan Holloway, right, is somebody that could take a big step forward on this roster. So there is potential for growth here, and I'm definitely not denying that. I think that's definitely like something that needs to happen for this team to have success. But I also don't think that we're in a situation where this team should be satisfied with where they are, right? Like we've heard there's some fading rumors about a Jordan Kyrou trade this summer. There's been a couple things there. I don't know if there's enough firepower on this team to really propel them to be in that like top tier of the Central Division. Like I think that the three teams that I have ahead of them are all significantly better in terms of what they can bring in terms of like offensive production, and St. Louis is kind of lagging behind that group a little bit, and that would be one of the things that I'd be looking to address on both the offensive and defensive side. But in terms of the offense, like I think the group, like everybody on this team, like there's nobody on this team that I think is really playing above their role. But I think that the players they have currently aren't like the highest ceiling you could have in those roles, if that makes sense. Like they're all just kind of like good enough to play those roles, but there's nothing elevating this team like beyond that, if that makes like the foundation is good. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of what I'm trying to get at there. But let's begin with Robert Thomas, because holy man, Robert Thomas is somebody that I've really liked for a while, but he really, really put himself on the map in the second half of that year, and particularly in the playoff series against the Jets. He was a absolute killer the entire time. And we talk about somebody here who is just so good at a lot of different things on the offense. He's so good at creating chances. He's very effective as a passer, in terms of setting up dangerous opportunities and putting himself in situations to be good at that. His zone entries are really good. His retrievals and exits are good, although he does botch retrievals quite a bit, but overall, like he's able to get the puck out of the zone and he gets it. He's able to win those battles. His positioning defensively and his ability to stop entries isn't fantastic, but defensively, and I think that's kind of especially as a center, you'd like to see him be able to clog those lanes up a bit more in the passing lanes. In the defensive zone, you'd like to see him be a bit more physical in front of the net. But overall, I mean, like in terms of first line center, Robert Thomas is like absolutely deserves to be in that conversation, as a first line center, and I really think that the breakout, quote unquote, that he had in the second half of last year and going into the playoffs really helped propel his stock. And I mean, you're hearing his name get thrown around a lot for Team Canada, and I definitely think that that's a good potential place for him to be, especially with the physicality that he can bring as well, compared to some of the other guys that are potentially in that fourth line center type role on a Team Canada. But in terms of what he can bring to the Blues, he really is just a very good play driver. He's super underrated as a scorer. His passing game again is very underrated, and it's somebody that I think really took to, like, he's become a bit more of a household name because he was shown on a big stage like the playoffs, especially against a team like the Jets, who had as many questions as they did. But you have the guy who won the Hart, you have the President's Trophy winners, and Robert Thomas was probably one of, if not the best player in that series, and that really helped heighten his stock around the league, and I think people are finally taking him, truly seriously as a first line center, and I don't expect that to stop. He's just very good, pretty much across the board, especially in terms of his like offensive ability, just play driving ability, and that's really what you need out of a first line center on a team that struggles to generate offense. Another player who does that really well is Jordan Kyrou, and Kyrou is a slightly better defender in terms of stopping rushes and making sure that high danger chances aren't happening against them. But he's very, very good at being deceptive with the puck. I think that's one of the things that I really take out of his game is just his ability to be shifty when he has possession and creating space and creating opportunities for himself. And it's something he's been really good at like his whole career. And again, like I think he's a player that just isn't getting enough recognition for that in terms of what he could be, as a playmaker overall. And I'm excited to see him, especially if Jimmy Suggerud is going to get top 6 minutes, and it seems like he will be. Jordan Kyrou's usage and like necessity to carry the weight on a top 6 is going to diminish a little bit, and I actually think that's going to be good for his game. Like I think it's going to give him more opportunity to be a bit more risky, be able to take some chances. He's not going to be playing against, he might get the second line shifts and play against, slightly weaker competition without, Robert Thomas and Buchnevich on the ice, which again could hurt some of his numbers. Like I don't know how much stock we put into the fact that like all three of those guys are really good, possession, transition players, in terms of helping him play, whereas like a line with like Shen and whatever other winger you want to put on that line, probably Holloway, maybe isn't as conducive to what he needs to do like for his game. But I think Kyrou's shown enough over his career to assume that he's going to be a pretty good puck carrier regardless of who he's playing with, and his ability to just create those opportunities and create scoring chances for himself and finish at a pretty decent rate as well is good enough. I don't really think it matters, like as long as his other two forwards are competent enough. And I think that even if it is like a Shen Holloway line, like that's certainly more competence than he probably needs as a carrier. And if he can kind of lead a second line in terms of his ability to drive play, then St. Louis really does end up having two really solid lines if Snuggerud can jump up into the first line mix there with potentially with Buchnevich and Thomas, and it really gives the Blues a lot more versatility in their top 6. And despite not having like a Kucherov type offensive creator, you still have two lines that can be solid enough, and St. Louis won a Stanley Cup doing that, right? Like even the Vladimir Tarasenko Blues in 2019 weren't this world-beating offense, right? They just kind of did it in waves, not having that bona fide superstar, but really having 4 lines that can attack you at a pretty consistent rate. And I think that seems to be the way they want it. They're trying to rebuild this team up, and Jordan Kyrou fits that pretty well. I like him. I'm a Kyrou fan for sure. Buchnevich is kind of like the third guy in that group, and like holy man, the Pavel Buchnevich trade is looking insane for the Blues right now. Like it's one of the best trades that they might have had like ever in the history of the franchise. Like just for the value they're getting from Buchnevich compared to what the Rangers got on the other end. And you're like Pavel Buchnevich, I mean, he is getting up there slightly in age, right? Like obviously he's kind of exiting his prime now, whereas like before he was like really in his prime, but he's been stable pretty much for 3 years in terms of his numbers. His defensive numbers have been dropping pretty consistently year over year, but his offensive numbers have been pretty good. His finishing overall has been fairly stable with a bit of a dip in 23-24, but it bounced back, so the overall 3-year average is pretty stable. And even his defense like isn't bad. It's just kind of like okay at this point. Like it's falling off a bit. But in terms of like being a play driver and being somebody who just is able to just generate a ton of chances, like Pavel Buchnevich is so good at that. And it really, like, Buchnevich, Kyrou, and Thomas really do remind me a lot of like what Montreal was doing, in 2019-ish, 2020, with like Gallagher, Tatar, and Danault, where like none of them were exceptional, like top tier offensive players, and Thomas is probably a better like pure offensive creator than any of those guys were, but in terms of like they're just going to spam chances, and eventually pucks are going to go in, and you're going to generate goals like that and just be like unrelenting. And that really seems to be what the Blues are trying to do here. And Pavel Buchnevich is like, he just really fits that mold, and he definitely fits like the identity of the St. Louis Blues offense really, really well. And I think, in terms of a top three, like, it might not be the flashiest names, but in terms of what they can do for this team and creating chances and just driving play and creating havoc, they're all really good at that. And that's all you really need, right? Like, you don't need flashy names to win Stanley Cups. You need good players to win Stanley Cups. And in terms of like what St. Louis has here in a top three, it's solid. Like, I really don't think it's a huge red flag, and it's not something that needs to be addressed throughout this team. I think it's a really good trio of forwards at the top of this lineup, and Pavel Buchnevich does a good job kind of fitting that, and he's able to play against extremely tough competition as well, and still thrive. I mean, obviously his defensive numbers, like I said, have taken a bit of a hit, but overall, like, you're really not seeing too much of a drop off in terms of what Pavel Buchnevich has been. Jake Neighbors is an interesting player, because Jake Neighbors is somebody who has a lot of hype going in here. I mean, he was 23 currently, and there's still some room for development here, but I don't know if the Jake Neighbors hype that was around a couple years ago is going to come to fruition. Like, I think, you talk about his defensive numbers, they're not going to blow you away. They're not very good. And his offensive numbers, in both in terms of finishing and creation, haven't been exceptional. They've been good enough in terms of like what you'd want from a second line winger, I guess, but it's more on the lower end of what he could be as a second line winger, and even a third line guy. I mean, Dylan Holloway has kind of jumped up, especially with the when Holloway was playing, he was very effective last season. Neighbors has kind of relegated himself to being a solid power play option in terms of his creation, but again, finishing isn't really there. So he's an interesting player, because I think he'd be an interesting potential trade piece for the Blues if they were going to try to improve the blue line. I think that like Jake Neighbors' name could get thrown out in a discussion, because I don't think moving him at this point is going to hurt this offense all that much, because of like what Dylan Holloway can do, and obviously bringing Pius Suter now too. They still have a surplus of wingers, which is why moving Zach Bolduc was an option for them. I think Jake Neighbors is kind of in that group where like his value as a potential asset in a deal is almost more than it would be for what he's going to bring on the ice. Again, like, I think the first bit of the season is going to tell us a lot about what Jake Neighbors' projection is going to look like, because if he comes out and is putting up similar numbers, then you're talking about a guy who's going to be, in his age 24 season, now entering kind of the peak of his career, and he still hasn't really fully emerged as a bona fide top six forward, especially for a team that's trying to compete for a championship. And maybe there's a team out there who still sees a ton of value in him, more than what the numbers have proven, and wants to take a shot on him and can move out an extra defenseman, and maybe that could help boost this blue line up. So Neighbors is an interesting case. I think if he's on the team, and he probably will be, like, I doubt he's going to get moved, but at least not anytime soon. If he's on the team, like, he's fine in the middle six role, but he's not going to be a game breaker. He's not going to, I don't see him reaching the potential that some people thought he was going to have, out of the draft. And, being able to capitalize on players like that who other teams might still have a ton of faith in, is an interesting place to be right now. But yeah, in terms of Jake Neighbors being, moving into, a top 6 kind of forward at this point. I don't know if I can fully see that as a full option for what this team's going to be. But he's still useful on like a third line. But and his power play numbers are still solid enough. But there's nothing that he does like exceptionally well that I think helps this team in the long run, right? Like I think the Blues need to improve, especially the blue line. And having these wingers that kind of set the floor a little bit, and do a good job setting the floor pretty high, but aren't really raising the level of the ceiling much, isn't super useful in terms of what Neighbors can be. And again, if he was like a strong like elite defensive like middle 6 forward, I think he'd have more value to what the Blues need right now. But he's more offensive, and his offensive numbers haven't been exceptional. So for a team that is looking for more offense, I think you can do better than what Neighbors has brought so far. But again, he's still young. There's still potential for him to break out, but he's not somebody that I'm super super excited about at this point. Brayden Schenn has been on a decline for a while, and I really think this is the area that is most interesting to me on this team, because he's still signed for another 3 seasons at a pretty hefty cap hit. And they bring in Pius Suter, who I think could move up into the second line center spot. But I think like Schenn is good enough right now. Like he's stable enough. He's not doing anything to like individually to raise the ceiling of the Blues, but he's solid enough that he can be like a okay second line center. But I really think that if the Blues are going to, and the good news for St. Louis is that like overall the Central Division's like center cores aren't incredible. I mean the Jets center core, like the Jets potential second line center this year is Vlad Nemeskov or Jonathan Taves that hasn't played in 2 years. So like, and they might win they just won the President's Trophy, right? So like it's not like, there's certainly worse second line centers out there than Brayden Schenn, but I definitely think, especially with like the lack of extremely high end pop on the Blues, that Schenn could be a bit of a liability in terms of if he's the second line center. Now, if Pius Suter can step up and recreate the offensive season that he had last year, which we'll talk about in a second, I think is fairly unlikely, but can also still be a really good defensive player, then he could be potentially the option at the 2C here for the Blues. And then Schenn slides down to the third line, which is where I think he'd be a lot more suited at this point in his career. In terms of what he does, like his playmaking is still decent. He still sets up a decent amount of assists. On the power play, he's fine. He can play against pretty decent competition, which is why I still am okay with him as a second line center, despite the fact that his numbers are clearly declining in terms of effectiveness. But he's still able to weather the storm. And if that's all the Blues really want in a second line center, then he's good enough to fit that role. And that's kind of what I'm talking about overall here with the Blues, where like they have guys who are decent enough to fill these roles, but not not going to raise the potential ceiling on the team. And Brayden Schenn's kind of a good example of that overall. Dylan Holloway had an interesting season last year. He definitely showed flashes of being that second line winger they wanted. I think the Blues are far happier with what they got out of Philip Broberg in terms of the offer sheets, but Holloway was good enough. And again, like it's another one of these players here. The Blues middle 6 is filled with these guys that like show flashes of being like really good, but can't quite get the consistency down to fully take over in those roles. And then Pius Suter kind of fits that too, and we will talk about Pius Suter. I do have him on here eventually, but it's a lot of players that like can show flashes of being really good. And again, like Dylan Holloway is super young. Like there's a ton of potential that Dylan Holloway can become a true second line winger. And again, like if the option is to play these guys with Jordan Kyrou, it raises the floor of what the top 6 can do. Whereas like if Kyrou's stuck on the top line with everybody else, with Buchnevich and Thomas, then you're really handcuffing yourself to what you can do throughout the rest of your lineup, because that dynamic offensive creator is kind of missing from the second line, and that's a big deal for a team that's trying to compete for a Stanley Cup. I've compared some of these teams to the Panthers that are kind of in this group, and Florida has a bunch of really good creators on their third and fourth lines, and if the Blues can't sustain something consistent on their second, then it's going to be tough to compete with some of the best teams in the league. Even in their own division, right? Like Dallas has a super deep, forward core that can really create on a bunch of different lines. And I'm not like Dylan Holloway can definitely become that. He's shown flashes of being somebody who can potentially drive a line, but it hasn't been consistent enough yet, and that's really where my concerns are, right? Like his entries are very good, but it's just about creating those passes post entry, creating good scoring chances when you get the puck into the zone. Things like that are really what I want to see him develop in his game. Again, there were flashes of it last year, and I think that does give me a lot of hope to what he can be. But it's finding that game in and game out, like knowing that you're going to get the same type of play every single night from a guy like this. And I think if the Blues really want to build this team up in a way where they're kind of even across the board, like they were more so in 2019, you just need those consistent players. And Dylan Holloway hasn't quite gotten to the point yet where he's been consistent day in and day out. And that's something that I'm intrigued to see if he can do that more, this year, and see if we can get more consistency from him, day in and day out. Jimmy Snuggerud is again, just a super fascinating prospect here that is going to get a full-time look, it sounds like, with the St. Louis Blues. Now, he is only 20 years old, so there's that. 23rd pick in 2022. And he has the body type for it, right? 6'2". That's what teams like in their wingers here. My thing with him is the floor is really high. The ceiling, I don't know how high the ceiling is. And that's kind of my concern with most of this team. But if he can come in and again show consistency and help raise, like, he doesn't need to be a game-breaking forward, because they already have three guys who can be kind of the drivers on this team. But if you can get a really, really solid execution out of the three top guys on this team, and Snuggerud can come in and really help elevate the floor of the top six, then you really have a very solid, it's a very solid, well-rounded group of forwards at the top of this lineup. And that's a lot to ask for somebody, even going into being a 20-year-old. Asking somebody to come in and be a solid contributor is a lot to ask. A lot of players can't do that. From what I've seen from Jimmy Snuggerud, it seems like he'll be able to fill that role fairly consistently. I have a ton of faith that is what we'll get out of him. But it is a lot to ask, right? It's a lot to bet on a 23rd overall pick to come in and immediately be a somewhat impactful player for the team. But I have a lot of faith in him. I've liked Jimmy Snuggerud since his draft year, more so since his DY+1, to be more specific. But we really saw him take a big jump in that first year in terms of his probability of being an NHLer, and he's been pretty stable since then. So I think the ability to come in and be a top six contributor is there. Again, I don't know what the ceiling is for him, and I think being in the NHL full time for a year is going to tell us a lot about what to expect from Snuggerud long term. Finally, Pius Suter, who really had an incredible offensive season last year in Vancouver, and he was a very, very big contributor for their success, and he really signed for a pretty reasonable cap hit. I was shocked at how little St. Louis had to spend to get him, and it took a while for him to sign, which is strange. I guess a lot of teams really aren't buying where he was, but his numbers are good. He hasn't, his numbers overall, beyond last season, aren't phenomenal, but especially for the money he got. Like, I certainly think there's plenty of teams who should have paid a similar amount to bring him in as, a potential second line option. And I think Suter is more suited to be a third line center, but like I said, kind of when talking about the Brayden Schenn aspect, is if Suter can prove that can be consistent and be a good two-way center, then his value on a second line will be a lot higher. And again, it will raise the floor of what this team can do. Like, I think if you're running a consistent Dylan Holloway, a consistent Pius Suter, and a consistent Jordan Kyrou as your second line, like the floor, the ceiling for what the Blues can do in terms of like what the top six can contribute to will be significantly higher than it is currently. And it'll give me a lot more faith that, the expected goals and the goals are both going to take a pretty substantial rise this year, if that's what we're looking at here. And I mean, Pius Suter defensively is also just really, really good. And that's, again, I think what made Zach Bolduc a little bit more expendable, because Pius Suter played a similar role in terms of, quality of competition, and was putting up, also very good defensive numbers like Zach Bolduc was, and was a bit better in terms of his, his play driving and his creation than Bolduc was in his rookie season. So there's less room to grow for a guy like Pius Suter, but you have kind of a known commodity and somebody that you have a body of work for, compared to Zach Bolduc, for instance, who was a bit more of an unknown after only one season. So I really like the Pius Suter acquisition. I think this could be one of the better signings from this free agent class, just based on the money and the expectation that comes with him. Like, I think it'll be fairly easy for him to perform above expectations, especially considering what he was paid. We move into the blue line, and this is definitely the weaker part of this team. Like, I don't think it's bad, but I definitely think there's a lot of work here, especially on the bottom, of knowing what the third pair is going to be. Like Tyler Tucker and Logan Mailloux is what's slotted in at the moment on Puckpedia, but that's it's not very stable at all. And you look around here. I mean, Justin Falk's getting older, Colton Parayko's getting older, Cam Fowler's getting older. Broberg's really the young centerpiece of this blue line right now, and it really is a blue line where the floor could fall out fairly easily because of just how many veterans they're relying on and how many young guys they really need to step up. And this is where I think if the Blues are going to fall below expectations, it's going to be because of this blue line. And, as we jump in here and talk about Colton Parayko is, I've been pretty vocal about my dislike for Colton Parayko being on Team Canada and potentially be on their Olympic roster, because he's not dynamic enough. Like, he's good defensively. His defensive numbers are solid. His entries or his exits are really good, and his retrievals are fantastic. And even his denials are pretty solid. But he's physical. He's able to clog up lanes. He does all the things that a good defensive defenseman should be able to do. But he brings very, very little offensive creation and excitement. And we've talked about this with a couple teams now, but if your number one defenseman is going to be, this defensive defenseman shutdown guy, like low event player, you need some offensive creativity behind him, and St. Louis really lacks that on this blue line, right? You're hoping Logan Mailloux can come in and be in full-time NHL this year and be, a exciting offensive creator. You're hoping that Philip Broberg can continue to take steps forward. He had a very, very solid season last year in his role. But you're hoping guys like Justin Falk and Cam Fowler don't fall off and can continue to be, solid guys to fill up the middle of this blue line. But, if you need, I think it's a lot easier to have your number one defenseman be a pure offensive guy than a pure defensive guy, because it's so hard to find players who you can trust to play the minutes of a third pair defenseman, and also be your one of your primary offensive creators. And it really hurts this team that Colton Parayko is pretty clearly their best defenseman right now. I think that there's a world where Philip Broberg becomes that by even the end of the season. But even then, like that's still speculation. That's still hopeful. And I think if St. Louis is really going to make noise, I think that you need Broberg to continue at this level, or you need Parayko to continue at this level, and also have Broberg like take a massive step forward again. And then then we can have a serious conversation about the Blues like being contenders in the Central. But in terms of like my biggest concern, it's just the lack of like offensive creativity from a player like Colton Parayko, and just what that does to like how that's a limiting factor in this team's overall like offensive creation. For a team that really, really struggles to generate and score goals already, it's the blue line isn't doing them any favors right now. Speaking of Phil Broberg, and again, like Broberg's defensive numbers, I think I want to start there, are solid enough. Like I definitely think that like it's good enough as a potential number one guy, and his creation last year was fantastic. He was so good, and so underrated in terms of what he brought offensively to this team. It's just the finishing that I need to see a bit more of, and just like the actual numbers continuing to climb. But he really, really proved like why he was offer sheeted, and why the Oilers probably would have wanted to keep him. But I think this is easily the best pickup that the Blues made last year, and one of the best free agent pickups in general last season, in terms of what he was able to bring here to the Blues and really helping give them another option behind Colton Parayko. And like I said, like I think there's a world where we end this season with Phil Broberg being the best defenseman on the Blues. I don't think the gap is like extensive at this point, but I think like overall in terms of like value, Parayko's defensive ability still outweighs what Broberg's doing offensively. But if Broberg can continue to raise his offensive numbers while stabilizing the defensive aspect of his game, we could be looking at maybe not like a full two-way defenseman, but definitely somebody who is an offensive defenseman that is definitely like not a slouch. Like it could be like a Noah Dobson type player where his defensive numbers aren't really talked about a whole lot, but they're actually like pretty good, and his offense is obviously like near the top of the league. I think that's where we could get with Broberg overall, if things continue down the way that they have been. And he's still super young. He's going to get a lot more opportunity this year, I feel, and especially with like the full year of Cam Fowler, that gives him a bit more support in the kind of the middle of the lineup here. So I'm expecting a big season here from Phil Broberg. I also want to touch on Logan Mailloux, who is interesting. Like he's such a fascinating case. Now he had a solid year, in Laval last season, where he was kind of bouncing around. He came up and played with the Canadiens for a little bit. Again, like I don't know what the ceiling is here. I don't know if Logan Mailloux is even going to be better than a fourth defenseman on a team. I don't know. Like I definitely don't see first line potential in him, and I never really did. But in terms of his floor, like he already should be getting a shot at the NHL. And he did a bit last year. He should be getting a bigger look this season. So as an NHL defenseman, like he's definitely there. It's just a matter of like where the ceiling is, right? Like where the cap is for him. And if the cap is a second pair defenseman who can lead a power play, and be a good offensive creator while playing not good defense, I think that's fine. Like I think that fits what the Blues need to do. And again, St. Louis is such a good defensive team overall, like systematically, where having players who really don't bring a ton defensively doesn't concern me a whole lot. So I'm interested to see how they use him. I really hope that he's not handcuffed. I hope that they allow him to be an offensive creator and just see what happens, because this is a team that really needs to score goals, and they really need to generate more offense. And I think Logan Mailloux can help in both those aspects, even if he isn't going to turn into an extremely like high superstar player. And finally, Cam Fowler, who was brought in last season and like immediately like turned back the clock and looked like a much better defenseman, right? Like the difference in like he was really at a very stable, like not good defensive like rating overall, like in terms of not defensive, but like in terms of defenseman, his overall value wasn't super high. He was just like a poor second pair defenseman. And then he goes to St. Louis and just everything just turns around, and he immediately looks like a a very extremely competent second pair defenseman. And if he can, again, if that resurgence that he had can continue even just for like one more season here until like the Blues can have another summer and really see what they have in some of these other guys like Logan Mailloux and Tyler Tucker and even Broberg. If he can be a stable, third level defenseman for this team, that'll be really good. And based on what we saw, like as soon as he stepped into St. Louis last year, I don't think that that's going to change. Like I'd be shocked if he's not at least like a similar level to what he was in his St. Louis tenure last season. And that's basically what they need from him. And if he can do that again, the blue line gets a bit stable. But again, like we're talking about a guy who's 32, going to be 33. It's not a lot to ask, but it's definitely like something that's not guaranteed with a player in that age group. And all of that creates a tough situation overall here, because you're asking him to basically you're asking him to be stable in terms of what he was, but at that age it's never going to be a guarantee. But again, if you can get a Cam Fowler, if they can get the exact same Cam Fowler they had ever since he stepped on the ice as a Blue last season, again this season, then they'll be fine in terms of what he can bring to this team. And finally the goalies here, and like I said, this is a very, very good tandem, right? Like Jordan Binnington he's one of the better starters in the league, but Joel Hofer is definitely one of, if not the best backup in the NHL. Like in terms of true backups, right? Like there's obviously tandems. Like I think you talk about the two goalies in Toronto, for instance. Like I think both of them are better than what Joel Hofer can do. I think both goalies in Washington are probably better. But in terms of like a true starter backup setup, I don't know if there's a better backup in the league than Joel Hofer. And I definitely think that he could get looks in terms of like being a tandem goaltender somewhere down the line. Even if the Blues want to move Binnington, right? Like I think that you have somebody there that you can rely on to potentially take over as, in a tandem role. But overall, like you have Jordan Binnington who gets criticized a lot because people just don't like his personality. But he's actually been a fairly consistent goalie the last couple of years, right? Like this is somebody who has, he had a very strong 23-24, but even last year, like his numbers were definitely not bad. Like he was, especially post Four Nations, like he really took that momentum from Four Nations and was able to level out his game after a bit of a shaky start to the season. And that was a big reason why the Blues were able to kind of stabilize and push into the playoffs in a Western Conference that where the gap between kind of the haves and have-nots is pretty wide. And again, like if you can get consistent play out of Jordan Binnington and you can have that stability behind him in net, it's really not an area that I'm worried about. And again, for a team like the Blues that really doesn't give up very many chances to begin with and has a super strong defensive system, you don't need a world-beating goaltender. And Jordan Binnington is above that in terms of what he can bring to the Blues. So, overall, like I think the goaltending situation here is more than fine. With both Binnington and Hofer, I think between the two of them, you have, like I said, like one of the better, if not the best, in terms of like what the floor is on this team. Again, like I think there's better starters out there, and I don't trust Binnington nearly as much as some of the other starters in the NHL. But when you have that stability behind him in net and somebody that can play, a good chunk of games and be good, it really does help, level out what the Blues can look like in net. Finally, the special teams, and again, like his unit just isn't. There's nothing special here. Like there's no true like huge game breaker on the power play. Like Pavel Buchnevich is probably the best pure power play guy the Blues have. You'd think for a team that's as good defensively as the Blues are, that their penalty kill would be better. Pius Suter was a phenomenal penalty killer in Vancouver, and I really think that could help a penalty kill unit that's really struggled the last couple of years. But this is definitely like an area that I think needs to be looked at, and I think Pius Suter definitely does help the penalty kill. So I'm intrigued to see what this looks like. And, the special teams, even like offensively, like there's enough talent that it should be better than like middle of the pack. But the penalty kill is absolutely an issue. And especially with the blue line, like there isn't really a ton of, like they really don't have any good penalty kill defensemen, right? Like Justin Falk and Philip Broberg are fine. Colton Parayko is okay, but there's nothing. There's no like stable top line penalty kill defender, and I think that's definitely like one of the big reasons why this penalty kill was so poor last season, and why I don't see it improving a ton this year, despite the Pius Suter added, which I think will help in a bit, but I don't know how much of an impact that has overall. So there we go. That is team number 14 on my preseason power rankings, the St. Louis Blues. I think the St. Louis Blues are a fun team. They're definitely somebody who's going to be in the mix for a playoff spot, and they have the pieces to, potentially win a round even this year. I mean, like I said, they were a second away from doing it last season, so there's no reason to believe that basically the same roster can't do that again. But let me know what you think of the St. Louis Blues in the comments section down below. They're definitely fascinating. Like all the teams kind of in this mushy middle of the Central are really fascinating. Like I said, at most, only 2 of Utah, Minnesota, and St. Louis can make the playoffs, and I think if any of those teams miss, it's going to be a disappointing season. So that's kind of that's probably one of the most intriguing storylines that I'm watching, is just how tight that the middle of the Central is, and maybe we see a team rise up, right? Maybe we see a Nashville really bounce back and they get into that mix too, right? Maybe we see a team like Colorado or the Jets fall off a little bit and they get kind of inserted into that mix in the Central. Like I think there's a lot of potential options here with that middle of the Central Division that could be fascinating. And St. Louis, I think right now is like slightly in the lead in terms of where I look at them in the preseason at this current moment, but the gap is extremely small between those 3, and I really think it's going to come down right to the wire with those 3, barring any catastrophic injuries. But let me know what you think down in the comments down below, and we'll see you for the next video. Also, if the audio on this one sounds kind of strange, it's because I'm in my new apartment. I haven't really figured out all the mixing for it yet. I'm just kind of unpacking and doing this, and starting school is a whole thing, so it might take a couple of videos to kind of really iron that out, but we'll still be here. They'll still be coming out fairly consistently, so you don't have to worry about that. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.